Once upon a time, there was a small town nestled in the heart of the forest. The townspeople were happy and content, living their simple lives and never venturing beyond the borders of their community. However, one day, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just a feeling of unease that hung in the air. People reported seeing shadowy figures moving in the trees, and strange noises could be heard at night. Then, one by one, the townspeople began to disappear. No one knew what was happening or where the missing people had gone. The remaining residents of the town were paralyzed with fear, and no one dared to leave their homes after dark. Eventually, a group of brave souls decided to investigate. They ventured into the forest, and with only their courage and determination. As they delved deeper into the trees, the darkness closed in around them, and they began to feel as though they were being watched. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream. Racing towards the sound, they found themselves in a clearing, surrounded by twisted, gnarled trees. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, cloaked in darkness. They couldn't see its face, but they could feel its malevolent presence. The figure spoke, its voice cold and eerie. "You should not have come here," it said. "This is my domain, and those who trespass here do not leave alive." The group tried to flee, but they were caught by the branches of the trees, which seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing around them. They were lifted into the air, screaming and struggling, until they were consumed by the darkness. From that day forward, no one ever ventured into the forest again. The town was left abandoned, a ghostly reminder of the horrors that lurked within the trees. And to this day, some say that if you listen closely on quiet nights, you can still hear the screams of the lost souls who dared to enter the forest. In a small town, there was a house that stood abandoned for many years. Locals whispered stories of strange occurrences and the eerie sounds that emanated from the property. Many believed it was haunted by the ghost of the previous owner, who had died under mysterious circumstances. One night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the abandoned house. They broke in through a window, and as they walked through the dark and dusty rooms, they heard strange whispers and footsteps that seemed to follow them. As they made their way to the second floor, they found a locked door. Intrigued, they used a crowbar to force it open. Inside, they found a staircase that led to a small attic. There, they found a dusty old trunk. As they opened the trunk, a noxious smell filled the air. Inside, they found a collection of old photographs, newspaper clippings, and a journal. The photographs were of missing people, and the newspaper clippings described their disappearances. The journal belonged to the previous owner of the house, and it detailed how he had kidnapped and killed each of the missing people. As the teenagers read through the gruesome details, they suddenly heard a chilling laugh, and the door slammed shut behind them. In the darkness, they could hear footsteps coming closer and closer. Then, a figure appeared before them, with a twisted, contorted face. It was the ghost of the previous owner, and he had come to claim new victims. The teenagers tried to run, but the ghostly figure was too quick. One by one, they were dragged into the darkness, screaming and pleading for mercy. The house was silent once more, except for the sound of the ghostly laughter that echoed through the halls. From that day on, the house remained abandoned. Locals whispered about the horrors that lurked within, and no one dared to enter its doors ever again. It was a typical Friday night, and Lucy, a young college student, was working as a pizza delivery person to make some extra cash. She had delivered to all sorts of people before, from families with young children to groups of rowdy teenagers. But tonight, something felt different. As she approached the address for her next delivery, she noticed that the house was in a remote part of town, surrounded by dense woods. The porch light was flickering, and the front yard was overgrown and unkempt. Lucy felt a sense of unease, but she shook it off and rang the doorbell. A man answered the door, and his appearance made Lucy's skin crawl. He had greasy hair, yellow teeth, and bloodshot eyes. He leered at her, making her feel uncomfortable and exposed. "Your pizza's here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man handed her the money, and as she gave him the pizza, she noticed that he had a strange, tattooed symbol on his hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen it somewhere before, but she couldn't quite place it. "Thanks," the man said, his voice cold and menacing. "You should come inside and have a slice with me. It's not safe out here in the dark." Lucy hesitated, feeling a shiver run down her spine. She knew it was a bad idea, but she didn't want to be rude or risk getting a bad review. She reluctantly followed the man inside, her heart pounding in her chest. As she sat down at the kitchen table, the man's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He kept muttering to himself, and his eyes darted around the room. Lucy tried to make small talk, but he didn't seem interested in anything she had to say. Suddenly, the man stood up, knocking his chair to the ground. "You need to leave," he growled. "Now?" Lucy grabbed her bag and made a beeline for the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pushed and pulled, but it was like the door was stuck. Panic set in as she realized that she was trapped. The man approached her slowly, a wicked smile on his face. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "But don't worry, you will be joining the others soon enough." Lucy's heart raced as she realized that she was just another victim in a twisted game. She braced herself for the worst, but suddenly, the door burst open, and a group of police officers rushed in. The man tried to fight back, but he was quickly apprehended and taken into custody. As Lucy was led outside to safety, she noticed that the symbol on the man's hand was the same one that had been carved into the trees outside. From that night on, Lucy never took a delivery to a remote location again. She realized that there were some places that were better left unexplored, and some people who were too dangerous to encounter. Michael had always been a bit of a recluse. He preferred to keep to himself, spending most of his time inside his small apartment. He never had any visitors and rarely left the building, except to go to work. Despite his isolation, Michael had always been cordial with his neighbors. He would nod in passing or say hello if they caught each other in the hallway. But for some reason, he had a nagging feeling that they hated him. Whenever he would come home, he would hear muffled whispers and hushed conversations from the other side of the thin walls. He could feel their eyes on him as he walked down the hall, and he was sure that they were talking about him behind his back. Michael tried to shake off the feeling, but it only grew stronger. He became increasingly paranoid, imagining that his neighbors were plotting against him. He started to avoid any interaction with them, even going so far as to time his grocery trips to avoid running into them in the elevator. One night, Michael was woken up by a strange noise coming from outside his apartment. It sounded like a scratching sound, coming from the other side of the wall. He listened intently, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. The next morning, Michael went to the building manager to complain about the noise, but when he brought it up, the manager gave him a strange look. "What noise?" the manager asked. "We haven't received any complaints from your neighbors, and there's nothing in the building logs about any disturbances." Michael was taken aback. He had been so sure that a noise was coming from his neighbor's apartment, but now he wasn't so sure. As he walked back to his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, Michael noticed that his neighbors had stopped talking altogether. Whenever he walked by, they would go silent, their eyes following him as he passed. He tried to ignore it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, Michael heard the scratching noise again. This time, it was louder and more persistent. He followed the sound to the wall that separated his apartment from his neighbor's and put his ear to it. What he heard made his blood run cold. It was a voice, whispering his name over and over again. Michael tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet and falling to the ground. When he looked up, he saw that his neighbors had gathered outside his apartment, their eyes wide with fear. "We tried to warn you," one of them said, her voice shaking. "We tried to tell you that you weren't safe here, but you wouldn't listen." Michael didn't know what to say. He had no idea what they were talking about, but he knew that he needed to get out of there. He grabbed his keys and bolted out of the door, never looking back. Years later, Michael still couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped something unspeakable. He never found out what his neighbors had been talking about or why they had been so scared, but he knew that he had been lucky to get out alive. David had just moved into a new apartment in a quiet part of town. The building was old, but the rent was cheap, and David was happy to have a place to call his own. One night, David was awoken by the sound of a dog barking outside his window. At first, he thought it was just a neighborhood dog, but the barking continued, becoming more and more persistent as the night wore on. David got out of bed and went to the window, hoping to see the dog and figure out where the barking was coming from. But when he looked out, there was no sign of the dog. The street was empty, and the only sound was the persistent barking that seemed to be coming from all around him. David went back to bed, but the barking continued. He tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It was like the barking was inside his head, a constant, unrelenting sound that he couldn't escape. The next night, the barking started again. David got up and went to the window, but there was still no sign of the dog. The barking seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the buildings and filling the air with its relentless sound. David tried to call the police, but they didn't take him seriously. They told him that there was no evidence of a dog and that he should just try to get some rest. But David knew that he couldn't rest until he figured out where the barking was coming from. Over the next few nights, the barking continued. David became increasingly obsessed with finding the source of the sound, but no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find the dog or any evidence of one. One night, David finally had enough. He decided that he needed to get to the bottom of this once and for all. He grabbed a flashlight and went outside, determined to find the source of the barking. As he walked through the empty streets, the barking grew louder and louder. It was like the sound was closing in on him, surrounding him on all sides. He searched high and low, but there was no sign of a dog. Finally, David stopped in the middle of the street, exhausted and defeated. It was then that he heard a voice whispering in his ear. "Can't you hear me?" the voice said. "I've been barking all along." David spun around, but there was no one there. The barking continued, growing louder and more intense. David realized then that the barking wasn't coming from a dog at all, but from something much more sinister. He ran back to his apartment, locking the door behind him. The barking continued, filling his apartment with its unrelenting sound. David knew then that he was never going to be able to escape the barking, no matter how hard he tried. From that day on, David lived in constant fear, always listening for the sound of the barking that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He never found out what had caused the barking, but he knew that it was something that he would never be able to escape. Mike was driving home from work late one afternoon when he saw a strange sight on the horizon. A funnel cloud was forming in front of him, right in his path. He couldn't believe his eyes. Mike had never seen a tornado before, but he knew that they were dangerous. He tried to turn his car around and find another way home, but it was too late. The tornado was moving quickly, and it was heading right for him. Mike stepped on the gas, hoping to outrun the tornado. But it was no use. The tornado was getting closer and closer, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up to him. Mike could feel the wind picking up, and he knew that he had to act fast. He pulled over to the side of the road and tried to find a place to hide. But there was nowhere to go. The tornado was right behind him, and he could feel the car shaking as the winds grew stronger. He looked out the window and saw debris flying past him, everything from tree branches to entire houses. Mike closed his eyes, bracing for impact. The car was lifted off the ground, and he felt like he was flying through the air. He had never felt so powerless in his life. When he opened his eyes, he was lying in a field, surrounded by debris. His car was nowhere in sight, and he had no idea where he was. Mike stumbled to his feet, feeling disoriented and shaken. He looked around and saw that everything was destroyed. The buildings had been torn apart, and there was debris everywhere. He heard a sound behind him, and he turned around to see a figure emerging from the wreckage. It was a person, but they were covered in dirt and blood. Mike could see that they were badly injured. The person stumbled towards him, and Mike realized with horror that it was one of his co-workers. They had been in the car behind him, and they had also been caught in the tornado. Mike tried to help his co-worker, but it was too late. They died in his arms, and Mike was left alone in the aftermath of the tornado. From that day on, Mike was never the same. He was haunted by the memory of the tornado and the destruction it had caused. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was lucky to be alive, and he never took anything for granted again. Mike's experience was a reminder that nature could be both beautiful and deadly, and that we should never underestimate its power. Once there was a man named John who lived a normal life. He had a job, a family, and a home. One day, he started to feel like something was off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt like he was living in a dream. As time went on, John started to have strange experiences. He would see people and places that he didn't recognize, and sometimes he would even catch glimpses of himself doing things that he didn't remember doing. The more he thought about it, the more he started to realize that he might not be real. Maybe he was just a figment of someone else's imagination, a character in a story that someone else was writing. John tried to ignore these thoughts, but they wouldn't go away. He started to feel like he was losing his grip on reality. He would spend hours staring at himself in the mirror, trying to convince himself that he was real. One day, John woke up and everything was different. The world around him was blurry and indistinct, like a watercolor painting. He couldn't feel his body anymore, and he couldn't hear anything. Suddenly, he heard a voice. It was a deep, booming voice, and it said, "You are not real. You are just a character in a story that I am writing." John tried to scream, but he couldn't make a sound. He felt himself slipping away, disappearing into the void. The last thing he heard was the voice saying, "Goodbye, John. It's been fun writing your story." And then he was gone, never to be heard from again. One morning, a man named Alex woke up in a strange place. He looked around and saw that he was in a room that he didn't recognize. The walls were a sickly shade of green, and the furniture was old and worn. He tried to get out of bed, but he felt weak and dizzy. As he stumbled around the room, he realized that something was off. The air felt different, and the sounds he heard were strange and unsettling. He went to the window and looked outside, but the landscape was unfamiliar. The buildings were all twisted and distorted, and the sky was a sickly yellow color. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Alex hesitated for a moment before opening it. To his surprise, he saw a group of people standing in the hallway. They looked at him with suspicion and fear, as if he was a stranger who didn't belong there. Alex tried to explain that he didn't know where he was or how he got there, but they didn't believe him. They accused him of being a spy from another dimension, sent to gather information about their world. As the days went on, Alex tried to find a way back to his own dimension, but he couldn't. Every time he thought he had found a way out, something would go wrong. He was trapped in this strange, unsettling place, surrounded by people who didn't trust him and the reality that made no sense. As the weeks turned into months, Alex began to lose his grip on reality. He started to see things that weren't there and hear voices that whispered to him in the darkness. He was slowly losing his mind. Finally, one day, Alex woke up and found himself back in his own bed. At first, he thought it had all been a dream, but the memories of his time in the alternate dimension were too vivid. He knew that it had really happened. From that day on, Alex lived in constant fear that he would wake up in the twisted, unsettling world again. He could never forget the feeling of being trapped in a reality that made no sense, surrounded by people who didn't trust him. It was a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Emily was a college student studying psychology. One day, a professor assigned a research paper on the topic of dreams. Emily was excited to dive into the project, as she had always been fascinated by the mysterious workings of the human mind. But as she started to research the topic, Emily began to experience strange things. She would have vivid, terrifying dreams that she couldn't shake off. In the dreams, she was being chased by a shadowy figure, and no matter how fast she ran, it would always catch up to her. At first, Emily thought it was just a coincidence. But as the days went on, the dreams became more frequent and more intense. She started to feel like she was being watched, like there was someone or something lurking in the shadows, waiting for her. One night, Emily woke up in a cold sweat. She had just had the most vivid, terrifying dream yet. She stumbled to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, but what she saw made her scream. Her reflection was twisted and distorted, like something out of a nightmare. The eyes were black pits, the mouth was a gaping hole, and the skin was pale and clammy. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Emily tried to calm down, but the nightmares only grew worse. She would wake up in a cold sweat, unable to shake off the feeling that something was watching her. She started to skip classes and spend all her time indoors, too afraid to go outside. One day, Emily received a package in the mail. It was a small, old-fashioned music box, with intricate carvings on the lid. She had no idea who had sent it or why, but when she opened it, she heard a haunting melody. As the music played, Emily felt her mind slip away. She was no longer in her dorm room, but in a dark, twisted world where the shadowy figure was waiting for her. She tried to run, but it was no use. The figure caught up to her and dragged her into the darkness. When Emily woke up, she was back in her dorm room, but something had changed. She could hear the haunting melody of the music box playing in the distance, and she knew that the nightmare was far from over. David had always prided himself on his sharp mind. He was a successful businessman, a devoted husband, and a loving father. But one day, things started to change. It began with small things, like forgetting where he had left his keys or struggling to remember a colleague's name. David brushed it off as normal forgetfulness, but it soon became clear that something more sinister was happening. David started to hear voices in his head, whispering dark thoughts and urging him to do terrible things. He tried to ignore them, but they grew louder and more insistent with each passing day. He started to feel like he was losing control of his own mind. At night, David would have vivid, disturbing dreams. In the dreams, he was being chased by a shadowy figure, always just out of reach. The figure would whisper to him, telling him to give in to his darkest impulses. During the day, David would try to distract himself by throwing himself into his work or spending time with his family. But the voices in his head would not be silenced. They grew louder and more aggressive, until David could barely focus on anything else. One day, David woke up to find that he couldn't move. His body felt heavy and sluggish, and he couldn't even lift his arms. He tried to call out for help, but his voice was gone. As he lay there, paralyzed, the voices in his head grew louder and more frenzied. David realized that they were coming from inside his own mind, that his own thoughts had turned against him. In the days that followed, David's condition only grew worse. He was trapped inside his own body, unable to move or speak, while the voices in his head tormented him relentlessly. He could feel himself slipping away, losing his grip on reality. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. David's body went limp, and he slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep. When he woke up, he was back in control of his own mind. But the memory of those dark days would stay with him forever, a constant reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the terrifying power of our own thoughts.